Resident Evil 4.
Hello and welcome to DNA the Soul, a podcast meant to explore the cultural impacts video games have both in and out of their subculture. Today we are covering Resident Evil 4, originally released on the Nintendo Gamecube. I'm your host, James Sadler, today joined by my co-hosts, Matt.
You will give me an egg.
Joe.
Gigante Joe.
And Kai.
Kai Krauser.
Before we begin, we would like to give some brief disclaimers.
So you guys know, today we will be spoiling the entire plot of Resident Evil 4. If you'd like to experience this game for yourself, please check out the remake. It's really well done. It's beautifully. It's definitely worth it. Also, the game is very Spanish, so we apologize for any cultural sensitivities from knowledge that we do not know.
And Kai, would you like to give us some brief acknowledgments before we begin?
Of course. First, welcome to our spooky month. So every episode in the month of October, we will be covering some spooky horror game, and I think this is a great way to start. Although there was a gap in episodes, our audio editor, Sayla, put together a review for Tanya the Evil last week, and if you're at all interested in that kind of content, please give it a shot, because it's really well made.
Now, originally, we said in the description of that video that we would be covering Silent Hill 2. That has been rescheduled for next week. This week, we are indeed covering Resident Evil 4. Now, we'll begin with a brief bit of background. This game's had quite the tumultuous development cycle. Joe, would you like to tell us about some of that?
For starters, it was started as a PS2 game back in 1999, but it would eventually end up being released 6 years later in 2005 for the GameCube as part of a deal that Capcom made with Nintendo to release 5 games exclusively for the GameCube, of which only 4 of them were made, and none of them remained exclusive. So that's a big reason as to why Capcom games stopped really appearing on Nintendo consoles, other than Phoenix Wright.
Now, the very first attempt they made, there were several attempts to create Resident Evil 4 during that time period. But the first attempt, writer Noboru Sugimura, was requested by the director of the game at the time, Kamiya-san, to make a cool and stylish action game. Unfortunately, that first build would be rejected, but we will get into a little bit more detail on that later. Kai, would you like to tell us about some more of those development cycles?
Yes. So the Resident Evil 4 that we got was, as amazing as it was actually Capcom's 4th attempt to make Resident Evil 4. One of the attempts later became Devil May Cry, so good time to be Capcom, making 2 super heavy hitter franchises in one development cycle. Shinji Mikami was the one who initially saw what became Devil May Cry and said, "This isn't Resident Evil, but keep this because this is good." He kept rejecting these builds until he eventually became the director of the game. So the development had some small difficulties getting off the ground because of the direction the game was going. Some developers really wanted to do something new and more action-oriented, but some really didn't want to go that way. They wanted to stick with like the horror aspects and not really delve too much into like action territory. And this would be reflected in the fans once the game released. Some were happy with the change, some were not.
Joe, could you tell us a bit more about the Capcom 5?
The Capcom 5 included Beautiful Joe, Killer 7, PN03, Resident Evil 4, and the unreleased Dead Phoenix, which I'm not terribly familiar with, seeing as it was never released. After Killer 7, which was the first Western Suda51 game, PN03 did not sell anything, but as of late has become a more of a cult classic title, and Beautiful Joe is still remembered very warmly to this day by its dedicated fan base as well, another cult classic. Resident Evil 4, however, did see eventual release on other consoles, such as the PS2 and PC over in Hong Kong, but due to the fact that Capcom released all of these games on other consoles, the whole exclusivity deal fell apart. Thus, Resident Evil 5 was all but confirmed not to be a Wii game.
To clarify, when we say the PC port, we are not talking about the one from 2014 on Steam. We are talking about a Hong Kong exclusive PC port in 2007.
2008.
Which I thought was 2008, excuse me. I just thought that was kind of interesting.
I just want to say, I can't imagine trying to play. I feel like RE4 on the Wii makes sense and how the gameplay works. but RE5 on the Switch sounds miserable.
Yeah, it doesn't sound.
The running gun, it's too run and gunny, so I'm kind of glad that didn't happen, actually.
Suda51 is a very well-known developer. He created games such as Lollipop Chainsaw. He also created the No More Heroes franchise. He has a very long and detailed history. If you're at all interested in video game trivia, look him up. Very interesting guy.
And I know the art for Lollipop Chainsaw looks like it wouldn't be a good game. Go play Lollipop Chainsaw. It's so much fun.
Yeah, there's a remake coming out later this month, I believe.
Be a good time to get into it. So now for a bit of a plot synopsis. So previous character Leon Kennedy is returning for this role. So previous knowledge of some Resident Evil is good for this game. Leon, teaming up with Ada Wong, Leon, the former police officer in Raccoon City, only for a day though, was promoted to a special agent working directly under the president, and his mission, to save the president's daughter, Ashley Graham, who has been kidnapped. She has been kidnapped and held for ransom to fund Los Illuminados, the cult, and its expansion. And plus, they mind control the president's daughter with parasites found in deposits of amber. With these deposits, Osmond Sadler, the main antagonist of the game, can mind control his followers, known as Los Illuminados. The priest Mendez eventually attacks Leon, but doesn't kill him. Instead, infects him with Las Plagas in hopes of turning him to their side. Leon eventually meets up with Ashley, but she is kidnapped and later infected, and now they have to cure themselves. So that is a basic synopsis of the game. It doesn't go into all the details, but that's the basic gist if you aren't familiar.
There's a lot of gross things that Leon has to fight while trying to save that girl.
So many
Yeah.
gross things.
Lots of tentacles. So some notable mechanics, first off being the inventory system for Resident Evil 4, which definitely owes its existence to System Shock 2's inventory grid system. They are identical. Although, interestingly, System Shock 2 never released in Japan. So, although it came first, I believe these were two independent inspirations to develop these systems. So that's kind of interesting.
My favorite mechanic is probably that the exploration you do throughout the game is rewarded, especially for a horror game like this. It's not exactly an RPG, but there are things you can upgrade, and the game rewards you for constantly paying attention even outside of the scary, intense segments.
It's like right on the lines of being an RPG where you upgrade your guns and all that stuff. But like, yeah, you don't upgrade the stats of your character. You just find bigger, better guns to shoot people with. Which, speaking of, the gunplay in the game feels really good. While the game has the bit of tank mechanics, you still, when you're actually like in the fights, it feels good, and you feel like, yes, I am going to unload on these not zombies, and it works very well.
Kai, do you have anything to add about the guns?
Mostly just the sound design. So some of the sounds when you fire the weapons in the game are so impactful. Like the shotguns and the magnums, just you feel each shot, and it feels really powerful. Especially when you're fighting some of the bosses, which I will get into here. First big boss of the game is Del Lago, the giant mutated salamander in which Leon's boat is attached to, and is slowly being dragged across the lake while Leon is hucking harpoons into its back.
So on Del Lago, he is probably one of the most impactful first boss fights I've ever seen in a video game. While the actual gameplay loop of hucking spears at him isn't the most precise thing in the world, it is incredibly unique to be dragged back and forth across a lake by this thing trying to eat you. That seemed incredibly impactful to me.
Especially when he tries to juke you by going underwater and then ambushes you from the side. It's great. But El Gigante, the next boss you fight, kind of generic. You fire at him until his parasite is exposed, and then you fire at that, and then he goes down. The next main fight after that is Mendez, who is an intimidating figure you see throughout the game, but you don't actually fight him before this point, and he mutates into this giant, almost scorpion-like creature. So he's very hard to hit, he's very quick. It's, I would argue, the first big challenge of the game. We have Krauser. I know I'm going a bit out of order here, I apologize. Krauser's later in the game. He's Leon's old team leader and trainer who has mutated with like a bladed arm of sorts. Although, ironically, he's weak to knives, so that's fun. We have Verdugo, Salazar's right-hand man, which I believe it translates to executioner, which is really cool. Kind of a semi-stealth fight in which he attempts to ambush you throughout several points in the map. And then we have Salazar himself, who he essentially becomes, like, he turns the room into, like, a sentient thing that attacks you, and that's super cool. Finally, we have Osmond Sadler, who becomes just the giant monster at the end.
The Salazar boss fight is the most visually impressive one to me out of all of them. Again, the fight itself is not super complex. You shoot at the target until you win. But I think, especially with like Dark Souls Bed of Chaos boss fight, I could feel some inspiration that was taken from RE4's fight, where the boss is the arena and you just have to find a way to survive until you reach the target.
So we have also the U3 boss fight, which was more of a puzzle in which you need to find certain targets to fire at, which will unlock gates that allow you to progress the fight.
So now that we've reviewed some of the mechanics of the game, some of the more interesting parts about its construction, we're going to go into some questions I wanted to ask my co-hosts here. Before we begin, though, I would like to observe a bit of commentary that we discussed in our research for this game, which was that, by comparison, Resident Evil 5 does lose some of the horror elements of 4. I think that's notable. And I think a big reason for that is the way you interact with enemies is very different in Resident Evil 5. In Resident Evil 4, each individual enemy can be killed, I believe, but you have to go out of your way to make them stop moving. You can't just fill them full of lead. That only stuns them. It doesn't take them down.
Right. RE5, you just unload on things and then they fall over. You have grenade launchers and a rocket launcher and big magnums, and you just have more access to weaponry and also ammo in RE5.
Yes, and the reward for beating the game is 2 guns with infinite ammo. Chris getting a Gatling gun to just mow down hordes of zombies with no thought or care of anything.
The reward and not just part of the game. You know, you don't have, like, your first experience with it isn't just mowing down things with infinite ammo, although it is more action-y than 4.
Another thing I wanted to mention while we were talking about Resident Evil 5, you do fight Wesker in a castle during RE5, right? That's where you run into him.
That's in one of the expansions where you fight him in the mansion.
Yeah, it's in a mansion.
One of the original builds for Resident Evil 4 would be Leon exploring a umbrella castle. So we did wind up getting Salazar's eventually instead, but I think it would have been really cool for Resident Evil as a franchise if Leon had been exploring one of Umbrella's old bases that had been infiltrated and redesigned. That version also had no Ashley, and Leon had a cool demon hand.
It is crazy the amount of changes they went through while developing this game. Fun fact, they did eventually, I don't know if it was leaked or released somehow, the source code for one of the builds was released, and so some fan recreations were made, although they're incomplete. It is interesting to see what their initial visions were for the game.
Also, I just like to point out that they had Leon with a cool demon hand, and then Devil May Cry 4, which ended up being, Devil May Cry 1 was based off this, ended up being, having Neo with a cool demon hand. I just find that funny.
It is funny.
How canon is the merchant, though? I mean, he is, teleporting around and has just all this stuff on him. How do you do that?
I argue he's very canon for 2 reasons. One, he was initially supposed to be in Resident Evil 5. He was supposed to be your merchant instead of just the menu.
I didn't actually know this. That's so cool.
Well, I don't know if it was supposed to be him exactly, but it was supposed to be another mysterious merchant of a similar vein. And the second reason I believe he is canon is because he's actually referenced in Resident Evil 8. There's another merchant character in that game, and it's a more rare dialogue, but sometimes when you open his shop, he goes, "What are you buying?" in a mocking way, and then proceeds to talk about an old friend of his that used to say that. So I believe he is 100% canon.
I believe that the merchant is just Wesker wearing a funny coat.
Hold on. So is there a secret cabal minion of merchants then?
That's
in the
what I'm
Resident Evil
thinking.
world?
There's some merchants guild or something.
That sounds awesome.
Right?
And all they carry is ammunition, guns,
His
explosives,
guns.
and funny sprays.
Yep.
Hey,
And
look,
plants.
when you need to blow things up, you need to blow things up.
I've said my piece about Del Lago. Do any of my co-hosts here have a impression of a better first boss in a video game?
Better first
Um,
boss.
okay. Hear me out. Hi-Fi Rush's first boss. Setting up of the whole stakes of not quite being this is the thing that you're taking care of, but still a adversary, and setting up the gameplay mechanics of the boss fights itself is done very well in that game.
I haven't played Hi-Fi Rush, but I don't doubt it. We brought up Souls earlier. I would say Gundyr in Dark Souls 3. Pretty interesting.
I wondered if someone would bring up Gundyr. I thought about it at first, and then I went, but he's just a dude with a stick who kicks you.
Yeah, until his
you're-
second phase, where he
Yeah.
becomes a giant goo monster.
But it might be that I'm desensitized from fighting him too many times, but he's just so slow.
Yeah, but thinking about the first time I fought him, he was super cool.
But
Yeah, no,
being
he was
sl-
something that got me to stick to the game that I really enjoyed.
Right. He was the opening act.
I will say, I think being slow is part of it, though, so that you don't feel overwhelmed by, like, oh, he's they're fast boss. Because Dark Souls has some fast bosses. You don't want one of your first bosses being, like, fast as heck. Like, you wouldn't want to play the game anymore because you're like, I don't know how to dodge this thing. I am running away from my life, dear God. And even when it goes into its second phase, you go, I am running away from my life, dear God, the first time. Because you're like, what is this giant monster that just appeared out of this creature?
He's a good balance of spectacle and being a tutorial boss.
Gameplay wise, I think he nails it. Appearance wise, I definitely prefer the Asylum Demon, though.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
How did Jack Krauser kidnap Ashley?
I have a theory for this. He got himself a job working protection detail.
He worked under the president before the events of the game, so
Exactly.
there is some validity to that.
Yeah, so then all he did was go, hey, Ashley, come this way. And then she walked in front of him instead of behind him.
Given the character of Ashley, he literally just could have jingled some keys in front of her face, and she was just like, "Oh, what? Yeah, sure, okay, I'll go this way."
That was what my joke was trying to be.
Yeah.
I was like, she's so easy to distract. You're like, come this way. Ooh, what's that?
Hey Ashley, does it smell like chloroform to you?
Do you think she was yelling Leon as she was being kidnapped?
She already knew about Leon's existence.
Yeah, probably.
So, on the topic of Ashley and Leon, do they hook up? I like to think so. Because, Leon was at least still friends with the president, as we see in Resident Evil 6. So, like, why wouldn't they just, keep
I
things together?
I really don't like to think about this.
So, look, they kind of let you in on it with the fact that Ashley has a specific animation for looking up her skirt, because of course it does.
Thanks,
Because-
Japan.
Capcom.
Yeah. Also, in the original release, they had a lot of lines being real flirty together, which unfortunately got taken out. I don't know. They were just kind of funny things that added to the characters, I think, and were just enjoyable, innocent enough things.
I
Especially
think
for a
feel
rated
like-
M game.
I feel like when you're in a zombie apocalypse, I know it's not actually zombie, but like when you're in this situation, you kind of form the bond with the person that's saving your life. And ends up being a little flirty. So it could just be like, oh God, I'm bonding mentally because, trauma.
I think it takes away a little bit from Leon's characterization to cut that stuff out. Leon Kennedy in Resident Evil 4 is supposed to be a classic action hero. He is supposed to kill all the zombies, get the girl, and escape the exploding island. And while, yes, it's important to give Ashley a character outside of that, and I'm glad they did do that. On the other hand, I think it removes a little bit of the fun and the original meaning of the story to take out some of those more traditional action hero cliches.
The rocket launcher at the end is the most action cliche thing possible.
Oh yeah. Great. Plus, when you fire it, it shows Leon firing it 3 times. Like, it cuts to 3 different angles, and then Sadler explodes. It's so awesome.
Can we talk about Leon Kennedy's hair? Like, what does he use to keep it so good in this apocalyptic world that he is in?
Probably gun oil.
I like that idea. Gun oil. He just full on slicks it. And he's like,
Yeah,
I look so good right
he's
now.
cleaning his weapon, and then he just slicks his hair with it. That's my theory.
I think it's the Las Plagas that gets into his hair, and it stays there.
I was just about to say that.
Like, he
Like,
gets
his hair is made
cured-
of parasite.
Yeah, he gets cured of it in the events of the game, but like the bit in his hair just stays there because they only do it on his body. His hair, though, his
Ah,
hair
Alright.
is still Las Plagas.
that's a good point.
I see where you're going with that, but did you know that human hair contains substances for months longer than the body does?
Ooh.
So that could be real. That could actually be real.
What's your secret, Leon?
La Plagas, because I'm worth it.
Las Plagas by Rob Vitelli.
Yeah, he starts selling it as like a hair product when he gets back.
No, Leon, stop.
I promise it'll make so much money, Rob Vitelli. This guy who's a magic artist. What are you talking about?
Is the rad recovery bed the lamest thing in the entire story? Now, I know there are some science fiction elements, like a little bit, in Resident Evil 4, like the fact Leon can survive the entire plot. However, for me, the fact they get cured by just, basically radiotherapy, while it's grounded and it's fine, it seems way too rational and realistic for everything else going on with Las Plagas and the rest of the story.
Well, if you look at the actual scene in the game, it is heavily exaggerated. Like when they're going through it, like Ashley's like covered in like shock, like lightning, and like the veins in her eyes like slowly fade. Like it is very heavily exaggerated to the point where it's, I think, as over the top as everything else in the game. So I think the way they stylized it makes it appropriate.
I agree with this. I feel like it's just enough done that it's like, oh, I guess that makes sense. That's a way you could kill a parasite. But also still like, you're going to shoot how much radiation to this person to kill this parasite? Like, that's a lot of radiation.
Kai, can you tell me about the Resident Evil movie? I've never seen it, and I've heard Leon's in it.
Yes. So there have been multiple Resident Evil movies, many of which Leon is present in his action hero form. One of my favorite scenes, Leon is riding a motorcycle and fighting two BOW dogs. So he's able to take them down relatively effectively. And as he's riding his motorcycle, keep in mind the dogs are already dead by this point. He throws a grenade behind him and blows up a family of 4 for no reason. So they definitely leaned even further into the action hero aspect of cool guys don't look at explosions. And it's even better when the explosions are completely redundant. So,
And killing innocent people.
well, yeah, but that's not funny.
They were infected. It's fine.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, maybe that was his thinking. They're probably infected.
He knew that the dog dead blood would like get into these people, so he's like, gotta take them too.
Yeah, there, sure. Let's. If you aren't familiar with what we're talking about, just look up Leon Kennedy out of context. It would be the first result. It's amazing.
Now we are going to discuss the game's scoring. In the before category, Resident Evil 4 has earned a 3. This score largely comes from the fact that it was in development for 6 years. While Resident Evil was a fairly popular series, they really kept people waiting on it. And I'm honestly shocked that Capcom put up with that length of development to get a game out. I feel like most companies would not be willing to wait that long for anything. They would have seen the previous builds and just told them, no, you're shipping one of these, whether you liked it or not.
I just want to say, I mean, they did technically release a build. It's called Devil May Cry.
Works like Siren had existed before this point for over-the-shoulder survival horror action games. However, they were not very well refined. The gameplay elements were not considered good. So while there were certainly some amount of projects done in this space before then, they were not great. And then finally, there was Onimusha 2, which was supposedly played by some of the developers that worked on Resident Evil 4, who saw what they were doing there and said, you know what, we could be doing something like this. That could make our game better if it was in this style. So that is how it earned a 3 in the category. So, as for the during portion, Resident Evil 4 received numerous awards when it was released. It also earned rewards before it was released. The other and final point in the before category we gave to it was because of the amount of hype this game had before coming out. It won 2005's Game of the Year awards from both Game Informer and Electronic Gaming Monthly. It was the first M-rated game to win Famitsu's Game of the Year, a solitary title it would hold until The Ghost of Tsushima was released.
And also, it was the second best Resident Evil game. It holds the record for best-selling survival horror game in 2012. And if you're wondering, how the heck does that work? They don't count Resident Evil 5, apparently, as a survival horror game, because it's not that horror-y.
Yeah,
but it is the best-selling. It isn't, but it's just kind of funny. It's like, it's the second best-selling, and then it's holding the record for best-selling.
This game was so huge that you could release something like the Chainsaw GameCube controller, and that's not enough to dissuade its hype.
Oh, what a monstrosity.
Okay, so what is this? I've never heard of this.
It's exactly what it sounds like.
It's a GameCube controller with a chainsaw blade of plastic stapled onto the end of it.
I'm looking
shaped
this up.
like a chainsaw.
What is? Oh my gosh! What is this thing? Holy!
There's also a PlayStation 2 version as well. Fun fact.
I think I'm actually looking at the PlayStation. Oh no, this is Nintendo. $400 also. Jeez.
Oh yeah, they're hard to find now.
Wow. Who would want that?
Anyone with a brain, Matt, obviously.
So as was discussed earlier, Resident Evil 4 was released on the PlayStation 2 after Capcom stated that exclusivity deal didn't matter about Resident Evil 4, mostly because it sold really well and they just wanted to sell more. When it was released on PS2, though, it had a lot more content. Like, they added side stories for Ada Wong. Wesker was a part of that, and that released a few months later in October, after the original release in January of 2005. And the PC port mentioned for Hong Kong was released and published by Typhoon Games. And it was published, funnily enough, by Ubisoft, since, Capcom wasn't there to do anything with it after all, right?
This is hilarious to me.
How even? I would love to know the backstory. I could not find anything about this other than it happened. But what? Why? How? Why is Ubisoft touching Resident Evil?
It's so weird. It's like Capcom making a Far Cry game. It just doesn't make sense.
I mean, if you just stop thinking about it, stuff makes sense.
That's a good point.
Also, there was 2 collector's editions, and one of them had a t-shirt. And if you have that t-shirt, viewer, you are the coolest person. Because I don't think I've heard of now, like, more recent games having t-shirts. They mostly come with, like, figurines or, like, fancy boxes.
Yeah, that is cool. It just comes with a straight-up clothing item.
I wish I had a Elden Ring t-shirt.
Yes.
I'm sure they exist, but it's so much cooler that it was something that came with the game. Like, they just don't do that anymore.
I think there's a reason for that. It's because physical media is dying.
Sad face.
No, let's not end this on a depressing note. Come on.
We're far from the ending. All right. Now, in the then category, Resident Evil has also earned itself 5 points. For example, Siren 2 was a lot better than Siren 1.
They figured their shit out.
Its predecessor that helped feed into Resident Evil 4 wound up being improved because of Resident Evil 4. They re-released the game on the Nintendo Wii. You can control Leon Kennedy with a remote, as funny as that is. A mobile version of the game would wind up getting released in February of 2008. And not only was it released on mobile, but in 2013, it was then released for Android. Although outside of Japan, you are limited to Samsung and the Samsung Galaxy Store. I'm sorry for non-Samsung users, you can't play RE4 on your phone.
I was reading the piece of script. I did not process. Like, you mean like on the physical phone, you play it. What?
This game has been released more times than Skyrim.
Honestly, I find it impressive that it can. I mean, like, it just shows how technology's come. Because, like, wow, I would not think that RE4 would just be like, yeah, I can run this on the phone.
It was on the GameCube. The GameCube has less RAM than your phone.
It's okay. They don't need to know that.
Speaking of the insane re-releases it got, in October of 2021, Capcom released a VR version of Resident Evil 4 on the Oculus Quest 2. It had so many remakes.
That's because the game was very fun.
That was fantastic. Having played the VR version myself, I can tell you it's one of my favorite ways to play the game. It's so awesome, especially the Mercenaries mode. It's amazing.
Oh, I bet the Mercenary mode is so much fun in VR.
Oh yeah, it's great. Not to overstate its influence, like so many other games took inspiration from it. Like the Batman Arkham series, like we talked about last episode. the over-the-shoulder camera angle, the aiming systems. This would also be seen in like Gears of War. Although Gears of War is mostly known for its cover mechanics, it owes its over-the-shoulder angle and everything like that to RE4. Dead Space, another amazing survival horror game. It was originally going to be System Shock 3, and then RE4 hit, and then Glenn Schofield was like, we have to change what we're doing, because this is amazing. And then other games like The Last of Us, another fantastic survival horror game. You see its user interface, its gameplay, it's so similar. The Alan Wake games, so many games took so much from Resident Evil 4. Without Resident Evil 4, all of these games would either be way different or they wouldn't exist at all. This game definitely deserves a 5.
Small thing, I know this won't probably add to the bonus points, but like, I love how they even took the Bloodborne enemies, like the withering heads, out. That's just 10 out of 10 with those little scythe heads.
Definitely, even its horror aspects.
I think Leon Kennedy could survive Bloodborne. One of the very few human beings that could.
Yeah. You kidding me? He like in Bloodborne they have like guns that do a little bit of damage. Leon Kennedy just come out. He's like, okay, I've got a machine gun and I got a rocket launcher. It's time to go.
No, you guys are thinking too close-minded. I want to see Leon Kennedy suplex a werewolf.
I want to see the Bowie knife only run.
Yes, that would be amazing.
Resident Evil 4 has earned a 5 in the Now section. This is because of the influence it has had on survival horror games as a medium. For several years afterward, including its own series within Resident Evil 5 and 6, it maintained an entire subgenre of gaming culture and put it on its back and said, I am the champion of all of these franchises. I am what's getting them through the door. And even today, we still have survival horror games that take inspiration from them, like Resident Evil Village, which is directly inspired by Resident Evil 4. And, I mean, it had a remake last year that was also incredibly successful in a market where remakes are not super well regarded.
If you're gonna replay this game, like we said at the beginning, play the remake. It's just everything you want out of the game and more.
Right, it's the original with better controls. That's it.
Yes.
And finally, we've got some bonus stars. So, first and most obviously is the studio's support. Resident Evil 4 has been released on everything from the Samsung Smart Fridge to the Nintendo Wii.
Hold on. How many remakes did we get? Someone count in the script, real quick. We have the original. We have technically the PlayStation 2 remake. We have on the phone again, on the PC.
Twice.
On the PC the original time, or like for 2007. You have then the Oculus version, right? Am I missing any other ones on the paper besides then the one that came out recently?
The Nintendo Wii.
Nintendo Wii. That's 9 remakes.
And later, the 8th gen consoles, the Xbox One and the PS4.
That is 10 remakes.
Yeah, like Kai said, those are the HD remakes. So, yeah, Resident Evil 4 has gotten around, you could say.
It's almost like the game is really good.
Leon Kennedy is a superhero.
Nah, he's just really good at his job.
All right. We also get a bonus star for construction. I mean, you built the game 4 times. And one of those games that we built was good enough to make a whole other game and a whole other successful series out of. I feel like that earned you a bonus star. Just a little bit.
Capcom was very patient on the release of this game, and it paid off for them. And we don't see that a lot in AAA development. Good for them.
Capcom over here accidentally making a franchise.
Whoops.
So, as for a personal taste, I'm probably the black sheep in the room. I do not like the tank controls. However, this game is beloved by my co-hosts. We are giving it the personal taste star.
I would have fought him if otherwise.
Yeah, I would have taken over the show. I would have just locked him in a closet. We would have recorded this episode, and then we'd have let him out.
For legal reasons, that's a joke.
Sure.
I am impartial on Resident Evil 4. I've only played the game once all the way through, and I did enjoy myself, but honestly, for me, it was not something that I thought I might go back to, but it was enjoyable.
And finally, as far as unintended enjoyment goes, like Kai mentioned earlier, there are previous builds that have been co-opted by the fan base that have had development done on them. You were telling me about like an HD remake for the entire game.
Oh,
that
yeah,
the fans
so
did.
It's called the RE4 HD project. If you're unfamiliar, look it up. It's amazing. It was this huge collaborative effort from the Resident Evil community to bring high res 4K textures to every single part of Resident Evil 4, improve the controls, and just really make it the definitive way to play the game. And having tried it myself, it's night and day. It's amazing. So having such a dedicated community that essentially remasters the game just through passion should be pretty telling.
That leads us to our final score. Resident Evil 4 has earned 2,467 points. On our scale, that puts it in the second highest spot, right behind Mr. Blue Hedgehog himself, which is
The blue blur.
pretty damn impressive.
It takes a lot
Thank
to
you
beat a
all.
Mario.
It does, but
Yeah.
given that we have not yet reviewed Mario's titular game, would put him on the scene and Nintendo on the map, I think it's fitting for now.
There's also
And-
extreme bias towards the blue rat.
The blue rat.
It is what it is. And that brings us to the end of our program today. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you. But I have one question before we go. What are you buying?
Leon, help!
No thanks, bro.
Resident Evil 5.
Resident Evil.